Yeah, so I became a part of this conversation regarding digital infrastructure in rural and northern communities through my work with Creative Labs North. So I was engaged as the executive director to really try and answer the question of how we bridge the gap between technology and creative industries, cultural industries in the North. And so my primary mandate is to work with our board of directors in the various communities in the North to try and find real solutions that work for us here in the Yukon. And sorry, my name is Michael Mooney. Yeah, so lending libraries are an interesting model. They've been around for a really long time. People don't always acknowledge them, but they've been around since almost the 14th century is the first reference to some form of lending library. Now, technology back then was different than we talk about technology now, but it's always been the premise is about providing access to the greater community for the benefit of the community and trying to leverage what the community has access to. Then we were talking about the printing press, making printed materials more available. We were talking about teaching everybody to read rather than just the privilege to read. And it had a massive socioeconomic impact on the development of human history. We're now talking about lending libraries in the sense of digital literacy and new technologies that have come forth. And while the ideas are sound, we struggle a bit with the realities of what digital technology, creativity, and culture means when it all kind of converges in one space. So a lot talk about traditional art forms and applying digital technologies to help them. But there's also this realm of digital space where you're not in the real world, but people are still creating cultural context. They're having dialogues and the same narratives that arts and culture helps us have in reality, but they're having it in virtual spaces. And to participate in a lot of that dialogue and narrative, we ultimately get to the places, how is the best way to deploy the model? So the model has traditionally been a centralized model where you have a physical resource that is shared in the community and is checked out, whether it's a license, a piece of software, borrowing a book, going to a physical place. But when we look at the great distances we have when we talk about the North, a lot of the communities don't have the resources to create those spaces in each community. We also then look to the digital spaces where this exists, and licensing models are changing. The way we create the content we create is changing, and the conversation as a whole, when we talk about digital technology, is happening in an area where we can look at bridging those great distances between communities using technology, but then we become very reliant on connectivity. And that raises the question is the infrastructure we're talking about is no longer a building, but it's a pipeline for data that we can communicate back and forth. And that also represents a unique challenge for us here in the North, because a lot of our communities have substandard connection when we think about creation. And so that's the big conversation. When we talk about a lending library model, we need to also talk about not just consuming data and knowledge, but we need to also have the conversation about creation of knowledge and data and content and what that actually means for us in terms of those physical libraries, those data connections, those licenses, access. It changes the narrative on a lot of those conversations. So I think as a whole, it's a great model to deploy. I think we just need to change our perspective on how we utilize it and acknowledge kind of the failures of the model. So it worked great when every community can have a library, but when a community can't have a library and doesn't have access, then we really need to go back to when we started creating lending libraries and the work that we had to do. And then it wasn't just about creating a space, but it was surrounding that space and those people with the resources they needed to make the most of it as well. And so that's the piece of the conversation that's often missing for it. We pay for technology. We're willing to buy a lot of fancy tools, but quite often we're not willing to invest in the people or the resources needed to take the most advantage of those tools and infrastructure. So, I mean, the big thing is we always talk about everything we benchmark everything for in terms of the digital world, and a lot of the dialogues and measurements is all around consumption. So if you think about something as simplistic as consuming Netflix, so we watch creative content, videos, what people are creating elsewhere, we don't often have the conversation about what it took to create that content or the infrastructure necessary to make it happen. Now, I'm not saying every single thing that we need to do needs to be the scale of a Hollywood blockbuster, but what we need to talk about is the reality of when we create something, there are more resources and infrastructure that's required in the act of creation than just in the act of consumption. So when we think about traditional art forms, when we talk about when a painting is created, it's not just the enjoyment of the viewer on the other end that's important, but it's also the artist's ability to create it and access to the tools and resources that they need so that they can create the pieces of art everybody else is going to enjoy. When we talk about sharing culture and historical culture and trying to preserve the context of that as we transform into the digital world, we need to have the tools and resources to adapt and transform and digitize that information in a way that can then be distributed and shared with others. So it's an act of creation again. And we don't have the conversation, we very rarely have the conversation around what it actually takes to create. And then when an artist comes forward or there's a museum or a piece of culture we want to do something with, we're great at creating a one-off program and parachuting something in, but we fail to have the holistic conversations that we need to really take advantage of what we learn. So when we create, it's a different space, it's a different mindset, it's a different set of tools and resources that we need, and we need to be providing that as much as the consumption side of things. So when people talk about creating libraries as an example where they're going to share content, that's great for having the dialogue around how we're going to share it, but we also need to have the conversation around how are we going to create it and how are we going to support our artistic and creative and cultural industries here in the North so that they can access and share their content and stories with the rest of the world. The digital transformation that's happening really is creating, it's a difficult question because it's generational in perspective, depending on who you talk to. So when we talk to older generations, they'll tell us how they just want to preserve what they've known, which is an important piece, but they often don't have the conversation about how do we transform that into a medium that future generations will be guaranteed to be able to learn from and enjoy. And then how do you protect that in a way that's significant to those that are creating it? Because not everything is for everyone. When we talk about open content, and sharing things, some stuff is specifically for a group of people or a community for their benefit. And so there's a lot of dialogues we're not having. And then at the same time, youth are engaging in this digital realm that is being created on the scale of 1-to-1 to what we know as the reality around us. So youth are interacting in spaces that are detached from that historical culture and that creation. They're creating their own things, but there's a disconnect because there's no tiebacks to the traditional art forms in that as well, because we're having these siloed conversations about how best to use digital technology. And so what we need to realize is that we need to bring those voices into the digital space as much as we need to bring the digital space into reality and have the tools and access for our communities to be able to do that. And that is a very difficult conversation to have because it's conceptual in some extent. There's people refuse on some levels to acknowledge that we have a world where people are earning and making money that's based on absolutely nothing except for ones and zeros being used in a digital space. And it's unlike anything we've seen before, but there's entire economies being built around it. We have ethical and cultural developments. We have people making decisions of how they're going to live and act and make a living and create content and culture and be creative. And that narrative is as important because that's how we benchmark ourselves as a society, is what's important to us. Culture, art, it all helps us tackle easy questions, but it also helps us face tough, difficult questions. But when we silo, we're really creating a dichotomy between two worlds that we're ignoring the connection between them. And that connection is fundamentally what is going to help bridge the gaps and difficulties that we're having, really providing access to all this. I mean, the world, you can create a piece of art and you can share it with the world, or you can share it with an individual around the world if you're connected into the means to be able to do that. And when we only talk about consuming or buying something online and that being the only access we provide, and we don't talk about the ability to provide that creation piece again, that is a huge disservice to our communities here in the North. And it means they have to leave if they want to create these wonderful things. And that's a disservice then again to the North, because the rich history and culture and creativity that we have here is lost because our youth and our artists have to leave to be able to afford to live. And that's not a decision we should be making people have to make, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Creative Labs. So it's a very complex issue, and that's what makes it sometimes difficult to have, right? And process, like the journey, and when you talk to artists in the act of creating, the journey is as important as the end product. And while everybody sees the end product, for the artist's development and their narrative and their story, that journey is the key piece that allows them to grow and be able to create something new and different. And we're at the cutting edge of what digital technology can do. And COVID has really pushed us into a place where it's accelerated the usage of these technologies to try and find ways to create. And then it's revealed all these barriers that we have that are very similar to our traditional barriers. So when we talk about infrastructure in the North, we often would talk about buildings and physical spaces and resources to do things as a barrier because they're not available. But now when we push the digital button, we realize that we've just shifted the barriers that we have to something else, where we don't have the digital connectivity. We don't have those digital spaces or real spaces to create the merger between the virtual and real. So it's a very complex problem, and it's one we have to not, we have to have discussions, and we have to be proactive, because the traditional approach of kind of patchwork solving problems that we have in the digital world, with the rate of change that we see, it takes us 5 years to solve a big problem, and that puts us 15 years behind because the growth is exponential. So we have to start looking to the types of usages we want in the future and start working towards those, so that we're able to keep pace rather than always kind of being reactive to the problems of the past. And that's a difficult conversation to have with a lot of people. Yeah, so as an arts community, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. So one is when we look at kind of the national scene, and we look at kind of, we have these massive hubs of arts, culture, access to technology and resources. We need to be able to, the remote and rural communities need to be able to access and tie into those resources until we can build out more resources in the rural area, which means there needs to be a real push towards collaboration and kind of collective works that really take a look at the needs of all of the communities and what we're trying to achieve, and not just hyper focus on kind of big centers. We need to look at decentralization. It's a difficult conversation, again, for a lot of those to have in the arts community, but the rest of the world is moving away from this idea of centralized places and resources and moving towards these distributive models that work around hubs. And a lending library, it really is a hub. And so, and when you branch out, you can connect into other hubs, and you can kind of create this mesh and framework of connectivity across the country that starts not just bringing the tools and the resources, but shares the ideas and the creativities and the culture for the benefit of everyone. In the North, we need to really start advocating for our place in Canada. The Yukon, the Northwest Territories, rural communities, we represent a significant portion of the population collectively. Now, the Yukon, as an example, is only 40,000 people out of 32 million, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be advocating for our place in kind of the mosaic that is Canada. I mean, we bring an incredible amount of wealth, both in resources and in culture and history and creativity to Canada. There are many significant contributions that the North has made to the cultural and creative landscapes of Canada. And so that needs to be recognized, and supporting to continue to develop that needs to really be in place. And that's only going to happen through advocacy. So whether it's Creative Labs, or whether it's other groups that are involved in film or specific types of theater or other forms, we need to come together to start advocating for change that is not just about consumption, of a product again, but is about creating that scene and that economy where we can create and share that. And then individually as artists, we need to, and creatives, I shouldn't say just artists because it's creatives, and kind of the mashup between technology and creativity means that you have engineers and artists getting together to do some pretty cool things, whether it's sound, whether it's digital, whether it's video, whether it's creating a painting in virtual reality or augmented reality. There's engineering is now entering the artistic scene. I joke around and I tell people that for 2000 years our engineers and our artists were the same people, and then for some reason in the 21st century we decided that engineers didn't need to be creative anymore. They just would do one thing and specialize in it. But we're seeing kind of that convergence again because of the pervasive use of technology. And so you have this really interesting dynamic between arts, culture, creativity, technology. And so individuals need to understand how that impacts both what they do and what the benefits and opportunities are. They also need to understand that we need the individual voices to speak up when they're not being provided what they need. Creative industries are an important industry and a growing industry in Canada. They feed our tourism industry here in Canada. They support our film industry here in Canada. We have tie-ins to almost every other sector because we find a lot of people in the north, their primary employment isn't in the creative sectors because we haven't built them out. So we have this spillover effect into all these other industries that we're nurturing, but we're not supporting. And so individually, we need to kind of take ownership of that and start working with the groups to really start advocating for what needs to be done. And the starting point is access, whether it's access to creative infrastructure or it's just access so we can find out about things and share things. That infrastructure needs to be a priority. And in rural communities in the north especially, that digital gap and not having access is putting us at a significant financial and economic disadvantage. And until we deal with it, we're never going to be on the same playing field as everybody else. And that's a big challenge for us, particularly in the Yukon, because that gap is growing, like I said, exponentially, and we need to do something about it sooner rather than later. And comparing ourselves to what was great 10 years ago or 5 years ago, or these benchmarks for consumption that I've previously mentioned, is not doing us a service. The only thing it's doing is it's padding the pockets of non-creative industries, and it's not putting the priority where it needs to be. So, I mean, it doesn't sound, the direct connection isn't always there, but I mean, internet itself, really how it's provided and how we access it needs to be reformed across the country so that creatives in rural communities can take advantage of it. And we're talking about culture and creative industries, but I mean, the reality is the digital economy, any rural community should be able to access it in the same way that anywhere else can, and that's not the case. It's an interesting development that came about in the 21st century, is this divergent. And I mean, to be fair, there are obvious social reasons why certain things happen, but I mean, if we look at where we are today and what the inspiration for what it was and the possibilities is it was somebody's imagination and creativity that created it. I mean, I'm going to make a Star Wars reference, or sorry, Star Trek reference and geek out here, but honestly, like everything from the automatic door to the flip phone and our tablets and everything is inspired from one person's imagination, and then everybody figured out or tried to figure out a way to actually make it real. And so we can't forget the power of inspiration when somebody comes up with an idea, and we have this blending of kind of arts and engineering kind of coming together to experiment, to create things. You get some pretty powerful things. I mean, we owe the digital camcorder to NASA because they needed a way to film something without taking film to space. Like, and so we have this blending that we ignore all over the place. And the advancements in our CGI technology is driven by engineers, but it's pushed by the creative industry and utilized. So the connections are there. We just, for some reason, we ignore them, or we don't acknowledge the importance of one element in the mix. So I think, yeah, it's It's an interesting point, and it's incredibly relevant today in this world where we have this kind of confluence between technology and kind of the creative sectors. And again, we're not having the dialogues we should. So creative labs here in the Yukon, one of our goals is to create, whether it's a physical space or a digital space, we want to create space to have those conversations and those dialogues, and it not be about a product that comes out of it, but the process itself and figuring out how do we do these things. Is there a better way to deploy a lending library? Is there better models that could work that solve us? And then just to give us a platform to advocate for our cultural and creative industries here. It's a mind shift we need to focus on, because we from a very young age, and our entire system is built around efficiency. So we quickly try to identify the fastest way towards a product, or we scope things down and put them in boxes in terms of academia and education. And there's this really hard push right now just to blow that wide open and really reflect the holistic reality, right? So we try to make everything really neat and tidy in these packages, and we lose things when we do that, because our society is messy and the challenges that we have are often multidisciplinary. And so when we silo down, we no longer have the ability to solve these complex problems, because we're coming at it from a very technical oriented solution where we have this very narrow scope. And as soon as we encounter something that goes beyond that scope or is too broad that those tools work, we're at a loss, because we're not educated how to apply social like problem solving skills to develop these problems. We don't tell ourselves that it's okay to take these alternative pathways and to sort out different ways of doing things, because we are so focused on efficiency and getting to the end product. Even when we talk about innovation, whenever I talk to anybody about innovation here in the North, or anyone, whether it's creative or in any industry, it always immediately comes back around very quickly to commercialization and product development. And that is a form of innovation, but it's not the only form of innovation that matters. And I would argue that in terms of our arts, culture, creativity sectors, is that those are the least important pieces of what we need to be focusing on, because when we push too quickly towards commercialization, we're not developing those systems that we need to have in place so that we can take advantage of that. So we have a 1 in 10 person being successful, rather than anybody that wants to enter that as a career being able to make a living at it. And that's we're doing a disservice for it, because those people that can't or walk away from their creative tendency, we don't know what we're losing when they're not creating. And so it's not that we need to let people just sit in a room doing what they want all the time. I mean, people need to work and make a living and put a roof over their head, but our funding and our systems really need to evolve so that we don't miss the opportunities. We need to be not putting up barriers for people to be able to create. We need to be finding the barriers are going to be there regardless of what we do. So our focus needs to be, okay, how do we help people get over those barriers and over those hurdles? And we need to be proactive, and we need to be talking about how we make things happen versus how we restrict. But because our entire focus is around efficiency and allocation of resources to an individual rather than to a community, our funding models are somewhat broken. We talk about things needing to happen quickly when really we're talking about generational plans that need to be put in place for some things. And so it creates these friction points and conflict that don't need to be there. So yeah, it's a really interesting conversation when you, and we're stepping away from lending libraries a bit, but I mean, the whole thing is a really interesting conversation about what models actually are going to work and how the best way to kind of deploy them. And innovation is important, and we need to be talking about the different types of innovation that are out there, as well as how we kind of create these systems that really support people in what they're trying to achieve. So it's interesting because in the world of innovation, when you look into it, if you study innovation, there are all these other forms, whether it's architectural, whether it's systems, whether it's social, like there are all these other platforms and methods that can be used and deployed and people can be taught to use, but we don't do it. And when somebody comes and says, hey, I want to run a social lab because what I want to do is bring community together and teach them how to apply systems level thinking and social problem solving skills to get a problem unstuck and move something forward. It's like, well, we can't do that. Like, and it's like, well, why not? Well, that's not innovation. I'm like, well, yeah, it actually is. It's exactly innovation. What you're talking about is more aptly product development, and that's not where we should be focusing on, because we I don't want to knock the idea of kind of creating a business and commercializing something because it's important, but there's no shortage of resources and capital in the world if you have a good idea and you want to commercialize on something to make somebody money. What we do have a shortage of is the resources and infrastructure being put in place that we can choose to do something different if we want to, where somebody can choose to do something for the benefit of a community because it benefits the community, not because it makes somebody a ton of money. And so lending libraries fall into that, is somebody has to choose to be able to create it for the benefit of the community. And they are never going to be a profit-driven enterprise. And if we can't have dialogues around how to adapt and modify those models so that it benefits the communities that we're in, then it's always just going to be a parachute that comes in and never really works. And then 5 years down the road, we have this nice fancy building that nobody uses, and everybody complains because we spent $5 million on this when we could have done so much more with the same money if we just invested in people instead of stuff. And so it's a huge part of any kind of model, whether it's a lending library, whether it's what Holly is doing with her work. We're kind of creating mobile systems that can go around. What we quickly find out is without the holistic approach, it falls apart very quickly, or it has limited success because there's only a limited number of people that can be kind of helped. And so that is kind of the acknowledgement of failure that we need to really be serious about. Is we need to be honest where we're succeeding and where we're failing. And for funders, that's difficult because they want to hear the success stories and they don't want to hear about the failures. And our entire system really doesn't allow you to have a proper dialogue about failures, particularly when government is involved, because they're on an election cycle. So even a failure is spun to be a success, and the damage that does is that you never have the dialogue about what went wrong and how to fix it. And you get stuck in a cyclical trap until somebody comes around and just breaks the whole thing, where you get these disruptors. And then people don't like disruptors either, because people then get comfortable with kind of that cyclical cycle. And despite them wanting a change, it's very uncomfortable then at that point to make a change, because you've created kind of this self-fulfilling narrative around how it works. So we think lending libraries are a great tool, but we think it's one of many tools that need to be in place. And I'm sure my colleagues would agree that their tools are one of many that need to be in place too. And we need to start having kind of these larger dialogues in it. So, I mean, so that's what we try to do up here in the Yukon, is we're trying to convince people to have these narratives, and we're starting to get some traction, but it's not easy. It's a difficult conversation, and not a lot of people want to fund it or participate in it. So it's an interesting conversation all the time. So I think the one thing we need to start doing is we need to start acknowledging that knowledge or data in the digital world is a commodity and a resource that's being bought and sold. And so it's not saying that we in the creative industries need to buy into that commercialization of knowledge and data, but what we do need to do is we need to recognize the reality that we're facing, and we need to have discussions around how we want, as kind of an arts, culture, and creative sectors, to have a role in that and start taking concrete actions to foster that and drive the outcomes that we want. We can't be bystanders anymore, and we can't wait for it to happen. We need to take a step forward and start doing more and more. We're going to see this idea where everything that we're doing, whether it's arts, whether it's a technical paper, it's all going to be data that's being created. And we had an entire system, whether we like it or not, that is being built around that exchange and access to data. And we don't have the dialogues that we should be having around ownership. So when somebody creates a piece of writing, we talk about copyright. When somebody creates an idea, we talk about trademarks. When, like, the creative industry creates something, we protect the intellectual property. But in the digital space, we're having the wrong conversations about how we foster that creation and that knowledge. And we're not having the discussions. We fall back on these ideas of ownership, and then we put it on a space where there's no way to own it because the entire system is set up where it's not around the same ideas. So whether how it's shared and how it's utilized and what people are going to do with it, we have no idea what's going to be done with it. And we should be having those conversations of how to better do that. If an artist wants to create a piece of art that is able to inform an event that they feel is important or a dialogue that is necessary, then we should be having conversations of how that's delivered in all mediums and not just an individual medium that nobody has access to. And so that's part of the challenge we face, because the medium is often as important to the act of creating as anything else is. And so when we no longer have a singular medium that something is being done in, it creates a very complex dialogue that both those that are consuming it need to be a part of, but also those that are creating it need to be a part of. Because if we're honest, if an artist is going to sell something, they need to have the framework in place that they can benefit from those digital systems as much as they can from the traditional trades and storefronts and that are available. And we're not doing it. We simply, we say we want to foster knowledge economy, we say we want to foster innovation, and then our actions do the exact opposite. We put in place plans where we state one thing and then we fall back into the same patterns, and we don't have the conversations that we knew. We try to brush off something that hasn't worked in the past, and we think because there's new technology that it's somehow going to work differently now, and that's not always the case. And then nobody ever has a dialogue around it. So there are ideas about trusts and collectives that really need to start having these conversations around kind of the knowledge economy and kind of innovation and what that means for us all, not just what it means for somebody that's running a tech company, but what it means for an artist. I mean, you have people creating NFTs, unique pieces of art that are selling for millions of dollars online. They don't exist in the real space. But is that a safe thing to do? Should we be doing that? Like, nobody's asked those questions. Does it devalue our creative industries? Does it prop it up? Like, we don't know, because we haven't actually looked at the scenarios that we wanted and then been honest about creating the steps we need to take to actually kind of influence those changes. So that's, again, what we're really striving for, is to create forums where those dialogues can be had, so we can help advise on how we move forward kind of collectively and how we fund things. And hopefully through engaging with the community and artists and creatives and kind of the cultural industries, we start to kind of create this narrative that really reflects the Yukon and what the Yukon wants. But the benefit is that we're unlike any other place in Canada. And so that's something that we can export to help the rest of the Canada struggle with the same questions too. And I would argue that our intrepid nature up here and our willingness just to do things and figure them out gives us, even though we're only 40,000 strong, gives us a great place for our creative industries to kind of be a catalyst for those larger dialogues. So I think the biggest thing we can do, the northern communities and rural communities need allies in the larger centers. So what we assume to be true, we need just to erase that. And we need to start realizing that even in Canada, we don't all start from the same starting point, regardless of the industry. And we're talking about culture and creative industries and lending libraries and these types of things, which are really important. But this holds true across sectors. Is we assume, because where we are and the access we have, that it's uniform. We're often told that it is uniform because the laws or the programs that are in place are there. But the problem is we don't have the same level of access, which means we can't take advantage the same way here as you can there. So we never are able, without the proper support and resources, to really take advantage of even the things that are being put in place. We also don't have the same platforms or access to the same platforms to be able to get a message out. So I think the two big things that really those in kind of urban centers need to understand is that it's not all a level playing field. And so when we talk generally about equity, not equal, equitable, it really comes down to access, right? So if I take a step away from the kind of culture side of things and kind of creative industries for a second, and I use the example of when we move all of our government services online, that seems like a great thing for an urban center because almost everybody has access. But when we come up here, that then becomes a major barrier for access because there are whole communities that cannot access those digital services, and there's no longer a physical place for them to go to access services. So we really do need to, anything that we're talking about, we really do need to have the conversations around whether access is equitable. And internet, unfortunately, whether people want to believe it or not, is one of those things that we need to be having a very important dialogue around, because everybody, even in the cities, urban areas, assumes that everybody has access, and it's true, but then it becomes a different problem in many of the cities, and it becomes a matter of affordability. And so again, we really need to start having the conversations around equitable access to what we're doing, and that is as important to the creative and cultural industries as it is anything else. So they need to have access to be able to create. They need to be able to have access to share, and then people need to be able to have access to them to consume. And it's a very basic formula, and it's a really difficult conversation because it's so conceptual for people to dive into right now. And the other piece that I think it is to be to look for those connections across the country and into rural communities, and that when we go to do something creative or we want to have a perspective, is we have the ability to connect in a way that we've never had before, even if the access is problematic. And with a little bit of effort, it can be figured out. And I think that's the part that I'm asking people to do really up here is that what we're saying is a problem. It is a barrier, but it's not an impossible one to overcome if we put in the effort to solve it. And so I think the questions we need to be asking is, what can we do to solve a solvable problem? Like, how can we address it? What do we need to do? We need to look to the future of how we want things to be. And then we need to take those intentional, purposeful steps towards what we agree is where we want to be versus just letting it happen to us. And we can't be waiting on government to be the ones that lead the way. It's fantastic what government does for us in this country, but government isn't designed to be innovative. No matter how much they want to be, the entire system is set up to slow things down, not speed things up. So we really need to be having the dialogues of what we can do as artists and as creatives and engineers to really move things forward to where we want them to be.